Hi, this is Paul. I want to follow up on the last number of videos that I've made. Many of those videos have been short and they've been sort of messy. And I woke up a couple days ago early in the morning and just sort of knew what I wanted to say. So I made a PowerPoint presentation, and that sort of helps me organize my thoughts. And so here we go. For a very long time on this channel, we've been wrestling with the question of what is a religion. And I sort of joked in the video about Emissarianism, because once you name something, this is sort of Jonathan Peugeot's definition of religion, it sort of coheres it. Once you have a name, it sort of coheres it. You know, the thing that happened with woke not many years ago. I remember when sort of the woke, anti-woke stuff was starting, they didn't really have a name for what today we call woke. And there are all sorts of other things sort of floating around, and everything sort of coalesced around woke, and then pretty quickly everything sort of cohered, and off you went. And some people, of course, would say, well, wokeism is kind of a religion, and, well, there's a point to that, and that's been, of course, treated quite a bit by many, many channels. But I want to get at this sense about what is a religion, and so then get a sense of, I made that video with a rather clickbaity title about the obsolete religion that Trent and Peter Boghossian share. And I have no ill feelings towards either Trent or Peter Boghossian, but it's difficult to try to get a sense of what is happening as the Enlightenment recedes, as aspects of modernity recede, as the culture continues to sort of have things change underneath it, and things that sort of held people, let's call them religions, you can call them spirits, you can call them ideologies, you can call them ideas, you can call them all kinds of things, but religions are a little bit beefier. As those things recede and other things sort of come to the fore. And of course, I'm getting the word Emissarianism from Ian McGilchrist, the master and his emissary, because I think McGilchrist, probably better than everyone else, sort of put his finger on what we're talking about in terms of a particular way of thinking and way of approaching the world that sort of reached its peak in modernity and is now receding because of a whole variety of factors, including the fact that in many ways its scientific justification has been eroding for a while now. Now, Jonathan Peugeot entitled his conversation with Peter Boghossian, what is religion? And of course, Jonathan Peugeot talks about religio and binding, and the idea that a religion is something that binds things. But again and again, I find when I understand what Jonathan is saying, and I think it's a tremendous insight, but I find it's a very difficult insight for a lot of other people to grasp. And so I want to approach this question about what is a religion in a different way. I think it's helpful to remember the dominant definition of religion that has held for the last couple of centuries in the Western culture. It was sort of came about in the Enlightenment, and it revolved around this distinction between natural and supernatural. Now, if you do a little bit of research, you'll realize that the distinction between natural and supernatural is actually a very recent distinction. But this distinction sort of held sway and has been used to, I think, good political effect in many respects in secular cultures in the West, in the United States, where you have this separation of, it's not a separation of society and religion, it's a separation of church and state. But that was a way of sort of teasing out and getting away from the kinds of confessional wars that had plagued Europe. And one of the things that the American founding fathers wanted to do was not get entangled in European wars, often when these wars sort of had connections to Catholicism or Protestantism or the various, even the different confessions that Protestant nations and churches had, were sometimes an element to these wars. I would argue that most of the time there were a matrix of other things that sort of came together that would bring a flashpoint, and then there would be a war. But it's sort of a shorthand in a secular age to say, well, everything here in this box that we can handle empirically, we should just stick to that, and all this other stuff, this supernatural stuff, or other things that they can't be handled empirically, we should leave that sort of off the table. And again, I think in many ways, secularization has been a very helpful thing in many times, in many places in the world, and it's brought a degree of peace. This is possibly true. I don't know that it's definitely true, but it's brought a degree of peace where people are no longer being executed for, let's say, not believing in the Trinity or something of that nature. Now, this definition has been so persuasive and pervasive that often religious people assume it and celebrate it. And you'll find many religious podcasters who basically set up this whole war as naturalism versus supernaturalism, and off that fight goes. And as I mentioned in a previous video, the based camp couple talked about that. Simone and Malcolm Collins talked about that in terms of internet culture, where you had the theist, atheist, and so you had all of these fights about naturalism, supernaturalism. Now, it's very interesting that Rod Dreher continues to work on this book where he's talking about enchantment. And even there, you can begin to see things in the culture shift. That you'll find people who wouldn't consider themselves Christian, but want to consider themselves religious or spiritual, and they're all about enchantment, even though they, let's say, resist what they might call organized religion. So now Peugeot pushes back, of course, with his binding argument, and I think it's a good argument, but I think the challenge of Peugeot's way of getting at this is it takes a fair amount of initiation to sort of finally see what he's talking about, and then you say, oh, okay, I see what you mean by a religion. Whereas in that video, for the most part, Peter Boghossian just keeps assuming and sometimes asserting the Enlightenment definition of what a religion is. Now, for me, a lot of this journey was underway when I discovered Tom Holland's video from a number of years back. It's a terrible recording, but the lecture he gives makes a lot of sense. The video says, did religion exist in the ancient world? Now, I just got back from Italy, and I was at Pompeii, and anyone who would look at the ancient Romans or the ancient Greeks or pretty much any civilization in the ancient world would say these were enormously religious people. And this contributes to what Charles Taylor calls the subtraction story, where there are all of these religious people, and they all believed in supernatural stuff, and then finally the Enlightenment comes, and we're no longer believing in supernatural stuff. Again, the difficulty is you didn't even have the category of supernatural. Now, I don't want to push this too hard. Well, let me first make the point, and then I'll qualify it in some ways. So any of us who looks at the ancient world will see temples and sacrifices, and these are the major things that are happening in the ancient world. And I was just in Pompeii and saw all of these amazing frescoes, usually with gods and what today we would call mythological stories from poets, just adorning the walls. And I'm currently going through Tom Holland's book Pax, and I found some nice quotes in there that I'm not going to bring into this video because I just don't have the time, and it's already going to take me a while to run through this argument. But we would look at them and say they're deeply religious. You know, look at Agamemnon sacrificing his daughter, and whether or not you believe in a historical Agamemnon or his historical daughter, we can all sort of understand what's going on there. Well, Agamemnon wants to placate the gods and have fair winds, and so he offers an extremely costly sacrifice, and it will prove very costly to him in the story, in order to get what he wants. And the gods see this and act, and we all understand those kinds of stories and how that works. But of course, they didn't see natural versus supernatural. These are concepts that come really quite recently to us. And, well, I don't believe that they're useless. And I also don't assert that ancient people didn't understand the difference between, let's say, the normal and miracles or wonders, or even if you look at New Testament language, acts of power, things of this nature. But of course, that was all embedded within a worldview of theirs that understood that, well, humans have certain capacities down below, but gods and powers and things above us have quite a bit more power. And so you try to work with these powers in order to get those powers marshaled and employed on your behalf. This, of course, is the root of the ideas about magic. Now, we look at all of this as if it's primitive. Now, it's also helpful to recognize that, for example, you can find in the New Testament that Romans had a distinction of sort of religious fights versus, let's say, things that were true or real or powerful. For example, if you read the end of the book of Acts, where Paul is about to be killed in Jerusalem because he is suspected of sneaking Gentiles into the temple. He's rescued by the Romans. And when the Romans are trying to figure out, now what is all this rioting going on in Jerusalem? The Romans will kind of look at this and say, this is sort of internal Jewish stuff that's going on between them, and we don't really understand it, and we don't necessarily believe it so much, we don't want to get involved. But that doesn't really make them secular, because again, I'm reading Tom Holland's Pax, and what the Romans, of course, believed was that their gods were stronger, and their gods were truer, and their gods were more effective. And the justification for their gods being more effective is, ironically, exactly the justification for anti-supernaturalists or naturalists today, saying that their gods are more effective for not being gods at all. They have laws of physics, and they have facts, and they have science, and they have cause and effect. And hasn't it been demonstrated that the laws of physics and the facts and the cause and effect, all these things that the emissary sort of puts his finger on and manipulates and controls, that these are more powerful than the religious gods? In other words, the reasons that the Romans didn't necessarily pay a lot of attention to Jewish intrigue within their own religion was they thought they can fight about this all they want, but of course the Romans have the greater gods, and the gods are on the Roman story. Well, why do you know that? Because the Romans are in charge. Therefore, you can see that the Roman gods are more powerful because Romans win wars. Just like someone today would say, well, if you have a group of people going out doing religious rites in order to win their wars, maybe you could look at the rest as history and look at, let's say, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and the Plains Indians, that they would paint themselves and say, well, bullets will pass over this. And of course, secular people will say, no, they won't. Let me show you, the bullet wins. In a similar way, the Romans would say, well, of course our gods are more powerful because we're in charge of you and we're in control of you. So then in 70 AD, when they finally took the temple and destroyed Jerusalem, it was just vindication that the gods of the Romans were more powerful than the gods of the Hebrews. And the same thing, of course, had happened during the Babylonian period. Now, what I think we need is a better definition of what we mean by the word religion than just natural versus supernatural. And this definition would have to you'd have to account for the Greeks and the reality that classical people didn't have this distinction of religious and non-religious like we do, or natural, supernatural. It would have to include Peter Boghossian, it would have to include Trent, and it would have to include Jonathan Pageau. And so on Twitter, even with the typo, I offered at least a first draft of this definition, which is, your religion is the meaningful collective agency you participate with in pursuit of your sacred time. And in that video, sacred time seems necessary even for secular systems of meaning, where I talk a little bit about some of John Vervaeke's work on meaning and his conversation with Alex O'Connor. And one of the things that is happening right now in many of these conversations is, because of pluralism and to avoid what would be described as sectarianism, we're sort of opting for these neutral words, and currently the neutral word in favor is the sacred. And then part of the reason that this word is so beloved and so helpful right now is because over the last while, all of the development in cognitive science which developed in the wake of trying to create robotics. You'd think you could, well, how we'll attach these cameras to a computer and then the computer will see. And we discovered, no, it didn't. In fact, there's a lot that has to go in for, let's say, a camera to be able to do something like keep your car centered on the highway or avoid a collision. Recently, Tesla, for example, took away all these little sensors that could sort of detect solid objects a little away from them. They're pretty common on cars right now, and replace them all with cameras. And that's not necessarily been a successful thing for Tesla. You can argue about that. But the idea was then you need to have a computer that is programmed, in a sense, to see down the road. And we began to recognize that seeing is actually a difficult thing. And out of this and all of that discussion grew the frame problem. Well, what was the frame problem? Basically, the frame problem is a secularized version of the question of the sacred, because there always needs to be, let's say, something that is fixed for all of the other things in a system to have their proper location. I'll say it that way. And that's why Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke and Jordan Peterson talk about hierarchies, because let's say if you're programming cameras on the front of your car to watch for obstacles and look for dotted white lines and things like this, you have to program a hierarchy into the computer so that it begins to see patterns. So in a sense, it can make sense of the plain, meaningless data that the camera is taking in. And the computer has to, in some way, intelligently discern that, okay, these dotted lines mean lines on a road, and we're going to try and keep the car here in the lane, and we're going to keep it going down there. So therefore, those dotted white lines are sacred, and those lines are understood and perceived so that the car will do what it's supposed to do. And in other words, you have a system where something is sacred, and by virtue of that thing being sacred, everything else can be sort of put into place by virtue of that thing that is sacred. And then you look back in history and you begin to discover that that's all over the place, that every culture has multiple sacred areas and things. And I was making the point in that video that, in fact, everyone sort of seeks a sacred time. We want the time when, let's say, your political adversaries, whether it be Democrats or Republicans or conservatives or wokesters or whoever, will be no more. And you find that it's I think it's nearly impossible for someone to have a narrative world without some sense of something being sacred. Sacred time, sacred space, sacred situation. I mean, basically, utopia is kind of the sacredness of everything. And this gets into sacred time is really eternal. And if you look at religious language, everything's sort of flipping to the eternal life, life of the ages, life of the age to come. You've got all of these ways in which happily ever after, something is sacred. And the pursuit of that sacred thing organizes everything else in the world. If, in fact, let's say you've got a reactive or a negative stance to something like communism. I just read these two very interesting books about Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII. They were very anti-communist, and so therefore the enemy of communism is your friend, even if he's Benito Mussolini. And so you try to employ Benito Mussolini to create a confessional state, and at that point the Catholic Church is trying to get back a lot of the civic powers that it had enjoyed at a different period of time. Now, the difficulty that we have with the Enlightenment definition of religion is that the definition is too narrow. While it's helpful to talk about Christianity as a religion and Judaism as a religion and Hinduism, this framework, again, is a very new framework. And people have, Tom Holland has sort of said a lot of this. I mean, there wasn't Hinduism until the British got there and looked at sort of this way of being religious that was continued to be propagated on the Indian subcontinent and looked at that and called it Hinduism. And then with higher resolution, you have Jainism and Sikhism and other religions developed, but sort of this family of religions, well, that's sort of Hinduism. And today we might call it Vedic religion. But what Tom Holland argues persuasively is that it wasn't until the British got there, they brought the categorizations there. And in fact, religion is something that is always with us. And in fact, it's always nested in our world. We are almost always pursuing multiple religions. And the more complex society gets, the more you can see that even under, let's say, a category of Christianity, some Latin Christendom or something, some big category, there's lots of other religions at play and lots of other sort of group things at play. So let's take a look at this definition that I'm working on of a religion, and we'll walk through it, and then we'll talk about it, and I'll illustrate it a little bit. So your religion, now again, everyone has one or at least many religions. Someone who is just, let's say you're Andrew Tate and you're just about getting sex, or maybe selling women for money and having good cards or something. That's sort of your religion. And we all get that use of the language. Someone who lives for baseball sort of might have baseball as their religion. But often our religions are far more subtle and often nested. In fact, some of these organized religions are really series of nested religious commitments all sort of brought together. And you can see that by the factionization that happens in pretty much every religion. You've got competing Christian groups and competing Islamic groups and competing Jewish groups and competing secular groups. And so religions aren't just these big things. They're these very subtle nested things, and we'll get into what kinds of things they are. Is the meaningful. Now religion's relationship with meaning is incredibly important. Peugeot highlights this in his talk with Peter Boghossian. John Vervaeke highlights this in his conversation with Alex O'Connor. I don't think Alex O'Connor would disagree with it. Jordan Peterson obviously has talked a lot about meaning, but the relationship between your religion and meaningful activity is very, very deep. In fact, in some ways, religion and meaning are almost impossible to separate. And again, you can sort of set aside the whole supernaturalism, and people find meaning in their political pursuits, let's say, or their activistic moral pursuits, or all of these different kinds of pursuits. And very quickly, things can become a religion. Communism can be a religion. Fascism can be a religion. All sorts of things can be a religion. And again, we talk this way. Someone might have a fanatical devotion to Donald Trump. I don't know if anybody has a fanatical devotion to Kamala Harris. They might be fanatically devoted to anti-Trump or something like that. So, but it's meaningful. It's something that grabs us deeply and drives us. And again, I made a video on Alex O'Connor's little story that he gets from Blaise Pascal about sort of how meaning and religion work. And I think that was actually a super helpful observation that he made. And that'll be a few videos back, and Alex O'Connor will be on the thumbnail where I point that out. That was in the Vervaeke talk on the dissident dialogues on that Unheard, or at least the Unheard People seem to host. So your religion is a meaningful, and it's collective. We are social creatures, and doing things alone is never as much fun or engaging or meaningful or satisfying as doing things together. So these things very quickly become collective. And so your enjoyment of Harry Potter, or your enjoyment of Norse mythology, or your enjoyment of Star Wars, or your enjoyment of your favorite internet guru, or your enjoyment of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all of this, we just love doing it collectively because we're strengthened with each other. And the worlds that we inhabit, we believe in groups. And this is why I'll often tell people, if you want to believe something, go find a group that already believes what you aspire to believe and hang out with them and live with them. And eventually you will probably begin to believe like them, which is part of the reason that churches are so important for the religion. Mosques are so important, and groups are almost always important for religious groups because people believe on the basis of the group around them. We seldom believe alone. We almost always believe together. So your religion is the meaningful collective agency. Now, agency is super important because, again, deep in terms of meaning is my ability to participate in it. Now we see this right now in the American political system because right now everybody gets one vote. And unless you're living in like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, maybe North Carolina will be up for grabs, Virginia, unless you're living in one of these battleground states, whether you vote for Democrats or Republican, your state's going to go one way or another. I could vote for my dog in the state of California and the Democrats are still going to win. That's just the way it is. But yet, people cannot help themselves but to get on Twitter and get on Facebook and get on YouTube and just politic and say horrible things about the other side, and everything that they see the other side does is just destroying the world, and whatever they see their side do, well, even if they don't like it, they're not going to say the bad things, but they're going to be all for one side or the other because this is what we participate in. This is our religion. And every 4 years, there's this massive religious movement in the United States called the presidential campaign. Now, the other movements never quite get as much because, we like having these figureheads. And so, again, it was Biden, Trump, and it was Hillary and Trump, and now it's going to be Harris and Trump. And we love to have these figureheads, but this is this massive participatory thing. And it's not just around people. It can be any kind of activistic effort. But again, we're imagining that my little tweet on Twitter or my little post on Facebook or my little video on YouTube is going to make a difference towards this sacred time or sacred space, so that if Trump wins the election, we'll never have to vote again. Or if Harris wins the election, then Trump, the great enemy of the people, will be defeated. And on and on and on, even though all of us know darn well that not very long after the election, and surely not very long after the inauguration, all the little battles of the really devoted people are going to keep going again, and then rise to a crescendo 4 years from there. It's this deeply religious cycle, and yet I'm got to participate in it because everyone has to get out there and, and if you're sitting on the fence or you're not going to vote for either of them, then, people are going to bang on your door. You've got to vote for Trump or you've got to vote for Harris or whoever. This is what draws us. This is what grips us. This is the meaning of life for many, many people. Now, of course, many, many people just sit out this whole mess and they're about their family, or they're about building a nest egg, or they're about having a good time, or they're about their sports team, or they're about these movies, or they're about a particular activity or something. And again, there's almost always implicitly some kind of sacred vision out there that all of their little things participate in and sort of pursue. So you participate with. Again, it's collective, it's communal. You're often trying to recruit others to it. Bass, in today's little estuary conversation, talked about narrative worlds, and it's a narrative world. It's happily ever after, and it's in pursuit of the sacred. If Trump wins, or if Trump is, it's pretty bad because, the Democratic strategy is basically, don't let Trump win. Now, of course, the Trump strategy was don't let Biden win, and then when Biden steps out, now they have to sort of shift, and but there's a sacred time, a sacred space, a sacred way that somehow, if my person wins, then heaven comes down to earth, and time stops, and you have the end of history. I've heard a number of Catholics talk about this with Pope John Paul II. And for many Roman Catholics, he was a tremendously charismatic and powerful and persuasive pope. And so you had Pope John Paul II, and then Benedict, Pope Benedict, and then there was Pope Francis, and suddenly the eschaton ended and the sacred time stopped. And now suddenly there's going to be fighting again. And for the other side, it's exactly the opposite. And on and on. This is a religion. This is the dynamic I'm talking about. It is pervasive. It is all over the place. Your religion is the meaningful collective agency you participate with in pursuit of the sacred, and whatever sacred use that somehow has a grip on your imagination, somehow, somewhere in your mind. And I think this is a functional necessity in how human cultures create collective worlds, visions, and religions. You cannot have this without some element of the sacred that your community and your effort and your tribe are all striving to achieve. Now let's talk about what I'm calling Emissarianism. And of course, I'm just building on Ian McGilchrist's work, The Master and His Emissary, and I haven't read his latest book. I've heard it's like this fat, and I've got this many books to read, and I'm so ADHD, I usually read whatever sort of possesses me at the moment. Some tiny religious spirit possesses me, and lately it's been popes during the Second World War, and now I'm looking at popes in general, and now I'm reading Pax because I wanted to have a better understanding of Diocletian and Titus, and then Constantine. Again, I've been looking at this book on popes from O'Malley, who taught at Georgetown. He's a Jesuit, and in this course that he taught on the history of the popes, he said it, so you can talk to him, that Constantine has been more powerful and more influential than any other single pope in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. And I think he makes a persuasive argument, because the more I study Constantine, the more I see how this was such a pivotal change in Christianity. And now, of course, this has been sort of a fight between the Sacramentalists and the Protestants for a long time. And I'm not going to just sort of say that it was a bad thing. There was bad things and good things about what happened with Constantine. But anyway, I'm straying. What is The Master and His Emissary? The Divided Mind and the Making of the Western World. This is smaller than his magnum opus that he has just done, and I was going to summarize it, then I thought, this is the kind of thing that ChatGPT does pretty well. Now, you can use ChatGPT if you ask it a question that you already sort of kind of know the answer to, because even now in a lot of these AI engines, they're saying, be careful because you won't necessarily tell you the truth on it, but I know what the book was about, and I think this is a pretty fair summary, so I'll just read it. Ian McGilchrist's thesis in The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World, revolves around the idea that the two hemispheres of the human brain have fundamentally different roles, and that the balance between them has profound implications for culture and society. McGilchrist argues that 1. Hemispheric differences. The right hemisphere is holistic, intuitive, and capable of understanding context and relationships, while the left hemisphere is analytical, focused on detail, and specialized in manipulation and abstraction. So there's sort of the main difference. And now I'm not a cognitive scientist, so I'm not going to necessarily live and die on this hill of structures in the brain and their implication, but I think to whatever degree McGilchrist's argument is biologically correct, I think it is exceedingly correct in terms of the fact that there are these two complementary ways of approaching the world that seem to be incredibly common in the brain structures of many, many creatures in terms of human beings, and that if one side, let's say the emissary, gets a little overblown, our engagement with the world gets distorted. So 2, the master and his emissary. He uses the metaphor of the right hemisphere as the master and the left hemisphere as the emissary. The master, the right hemisphere, understands the broader context and the bigger picture, while the emissary, left hemisphere, is meant to serve the master by dealing with details and specific tasks. Now, again, I always say emissary and master because I'm dyslexic and I even get the words right and left mixed up, and I misspeak so often. So it's just easier for me to talk about mastermind and emissary mind, and that's why I talk about this particular obsolete religion that Trent Horn and Peter Boghossian share as Emissarianism, because it is in some ways the cult of that one approach to the world at the expense of the bigger approach to the world, whereas in fact these two approaches need to work together. Cultural implications. McGilchrist suggests that Western culture has increasingly become dominated by the left hemisphere's mode of thinking, which has led to a fragmented, decontextualized, and mechanistic worldview. This dominance has marginalized the most holistic and integrative approach of the hemispheres. Historical perspective. He traces the historical shift in hemispheric dominance from ancient times to the modern era, arguing that periods of flourishing culture and creativity correspond to a balance between the two hemispheres, whereas periods of decline are marked by the left hemispheric dominance. Consequences and solutions. McGilchrist warns of the consequence of left hemisphere dominance, including the erosion of social cohesion, environmental degradation, and a loss of meaning. He advocates for a rebalancing of the hemispheres to foster a more integrated and sustainable way of living. Overall, McGilchrist's work combines neuroscience, psychology, philosophy, and history to explore how the interplay between the brain's hemispheres has shaped human experience and society. You don't have to buy all of this to understand the distinction and the point that I'm making with respect to the hemispheres. And I thought the way to talk about this would be to use an illustration, because I'm a preacher and I know that people need illustrations. So I'm not going to play this video, but it's a video, and it's a pretty significant video, and Algo serves up for me all kinds of videos about why China is failing, whether it's population collapse or this or that or this or that. And this particular YouTube channel, Money and Macro, I guess an economist runs it. How good of an economist is, I have no idea. How good of an argument he makes, I have no idea. Seems plausible to me, but what do I know? I'm not an economist, and I'm not Chinese, and I've never been to China. But I find these kinds of things rather interesting, and so I watched the video. My point is not so much his argument about why the Chinese economy is failing and what's happening in China. My point is just to watch how we process information and how we process the world. And, well, let's get going. So the subject matter is mostly incidental to my argument. I want to observe, though, how we think, process, and operate. Emissarian thinking is unavoidable for most of us today. It's deep within our culture, and our culture sort of programs us, and we get reinforced. I've used a video often, quite a bit in the past now, from the Veritas Forum of Dallas Willard, who's talking about walking through a university campus and just watching how people's behavior change. This is because of social pressure. You gain status in certain places by talking one way. You lose status by talking another way. And so emissarianism, or sort of, let's say, right, see, I always get it mixed up. Right brain thinking, when that's sort of dominant in the social imaginary and you gain status by doing this, well, it gets reinforced, and then people who are very sensitive to status differentials sort of adjust their speech in order to be on the right side of whatever group they're around. So emissarian thinking is unavoidable for most of us today and incredibly useful. There's a reason you have both hemispheres, and a reason that these two approaches are complementary. Too much big picture and not enough details, you're in trouble. But Gilchrist talks about it like you both have to hunt and eat and also be aware of your surroundings. Because if you're not aware of your surroundings, you might get eaten. And if you can't hunt and eat and get specific, well, then you're going to starve. And so, actually, again, these both ways work together. But it's difficult for many inside of it to notice it because it's completely intuitive and almost the definition of true for many people. Now here are some assumptions, most of which we simply assume. The USA is a thing. They get that flag and that little bar, and that means something to us. China is a thing. And an economy is a thing. And we can talk about these things. Again, already we have all of these things, and things can be measured and talked about and manipulated and all of this. Whereas, so economy is a thing and growth is a thing. And these things can be measured, understood, and studied. Now, Vervaeke in prior videos built on Tim Morton's work on hyperobjects. And I think it's helpful, even though I don't like the term very much. The United States is a hyperobject. It's a thing, but it's not really a thing. You can't really point to the United States because it's not like pointing to this lens cap. This lens cap is a thing, but the United States is not a thing in the same way that this lens cap is. And if you search Vervaeke hyperobjects, John Vervaeke sort of nicely walks through, okay, what is a hyperobject? How is it a different thing than other things? And John does that so well. I'm just going to point to John to do that because I can't do it as well as John. But it's an incredibly useful distinction to make with respect to how we deal with the world. Because if you listen to this video, and all of us do it easily, we just assume that when he's talking about the United States and China and the economy and growth and recession and agriculture and industrialization and service economies and forms of government and all of these things, they're all things, even though none of those things are like this thing. And Emissarianism is all about treating everything like it's this thing. And these useful abstractions and reductions are astoundingly useful, but always in many ways limited. USA, China, economy, wealth, power, prosperity. We thingify all of these things, but they are not objects like a spoon. They are hyperobjects. The emissary brain creates objects out of these things so that it can manipulate them and tell stories about them that seem to help us know when to buy stocks, when to sell stocks, when to visit China, when not to visit China, how to vote in the United States election, yada, yada, yada. We just connect all of these things, and if you talk to many people, they say, well, these are all facts. The United States is not a fact like my lens cap is a fact or a spoon is a fact. The United States is an enormously difficult thing to talk about or understand or get our mind around it. Now, in a video like this, there's a reality out there, and we engage with that reality. And it's not like he's lying or not telling the truth, but our grasp on many of these truths is extremely limited and almost always continually subject to updating. Now, when we get into this making things out of things that really aren't things, hyperobjects, let's say, right there you can begin to understand Boghossian religion. Because when you see the United States as a thing, Boghossian says, well, actually, that's sort of a religious function. Because you can't understand the United States as a thing without sort of this function that turns it into a thing. And it's an incredibly important insight when Jonathan says that's actually a religion. Because when you think about the United States as a thing, C.S. Lewis in his book Miracles would talk about Euston Station. And I would hear that, and I had no idea what a Euston Station was. I assumed it was a train station, and I had some inkling of what train stations were. I'd been to Grand Central Station in New York, and when I lived in New Jersey, I could take the train to New York City and see some train stations. But then eventually, when I visited London, I was able to go to Euston Station. It's like, here is Euston Station. And C.S. Lewis was onto this already because he said, in many ways, London for me is Euston Station. Now, C.S. Lewis didn't drive. And so this gets into a whole bunch of things we've been talking about in the corner for a long time. Sort of the phenomenological world of C.S. Lewis as this strange bachelor who couldn't drive and was missing a joint on his thumb and was incredibly brilliant in some areas, but incredibly useless in other areas. But for him, he understood quite well that London, his grasp on London, Again, the map and the territory were completely different things. We get into combinatorial explosiveness. You cannot begin to map sufficiently. Even a small town, never much a city with as much history and scale and importance and significance and meaning and influence as something like London. So it gets reduced in him down to Euston Station. And now traveling for me, I'm listening to Pax, and we're talking about the Roman Forum and the Capitol Hill and the Palatine Hill, and now I've got pictures in my mind of these places because I walked around on them, or at least the ruins in them now, and so I have still fuzzy but little less fuzzy images than I had before of so much because I was actually able to go there. Now, emissary brain, again, is used to sort of picking out things and manipulating things and coming to judgments and making decisions. And it's astoundingly powerful and incredibly important that we're able to do that, because C.S. Lewis could not get from Oxford to Euston Station without that capacity about what a ticket was and which train to go on and what a seat was and how to eat and all of those things. You need the emissary brain in order to do that. But if you just assume that the emissary brain, if you don't understand the limited handle the emissary brain has on the world, well, things are going to get weird and come apart quickly. And so again, Peugeot's argument about religion comes in here because it sort of captures things. The United States, what is the United States? People have stories in their mind about George Washington and a cherry tree, an American flag, or a 4th of July parade, or paying their taxes, or getting drafted into the military, or going to public school, or all of these things. And they're all true, but they don't all match each other's. So the United States is actually a tremendously difficult thing that all of our thinginess sort of comprehends. And Peugeot is right that that's sort of a religion that grasps it and we manipulate it with. Something binds stuff into the United States or China or the economy or prosperity or London or Sacramento or all of these things. Now, these hyperobjects are manipulatable, intelligible, and together we can express our agency upon them or through them in order to achieve things. And this is meaningful things, sacred things. This is the goal we're trying to do. We have sacred goals for them. We want the United States to become home of the brave and land of the free, from sea to shining sea, yada yada. Hail Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Or maybe give me your tired, we have all these sort of sacred images of what they would become, and we hold them implicitly, but they're always there, and they always operate on us, and they always sort of direct our meaningful agency one way or another. It's simply how we're working. And again, I would argue it's kind of a religion. Those who consider themselves Chinese or allies hope that China succeeds in becoming a superpower. But in this video, he tells us why Americans and their allies hope that they don't, and he tells us why China's going to have an economic collapse, and what's going to happen he doesn't know, but China's sort of had a little golden age and it's coming to an end, and he traces that. And I found it a very interesting video, and I learned a lot. How true is it? I don't know. It's true enough for me to hold, but if someone comes to me with another video and says, no, this video tells a lot better what it means, I'll sort of weigh it, and maybe I'll say, yeah, that's a better video. But why did I judge one thing to be better than the other? Probably because I have within me this entire matrix that I believe is true. I don't know who's running a leaf blower out there. We certainly don't have any leaves this time of year. That I believe is true, and so I sort of match them up against it. And so then all these other religious powers in me begin to operate, and about Christianity or my patriotism or my identity or all these other things then operate on this new data that comes in, and then I either find it compelling or I don't find it compelling. And then I'll say, yeah, the other was a better video, or no, this was a better video. And then I'll give arguments for it, and on we go. And this is what we do. These sacred goals, these are sacred goals because we don't just hope that these things happen for 10 minutes or 100 minutes. If I could put time in a bottle, why can't we make love stay? We all sort of imagine this sacred time when happily ever after, and it's the end of The Princess Bride. It's everyone's standing in that ceremony at the end of one of the decent Star Wars movies, and they're all given medals, or people right now in the Olympics are giving an Olympic medal, and so there's this moment, and it becomes a sacred moment and sacred time, and it's sort of outside of ordinary time. And it's kind of like Vervaeke's question, to be true even if you didn't exist. And in that sense, his truth is sort of Platonic, sort of lifted out of the hustle and bustle of normal time and becomes this sacred moment. We have ceremonies in order to achieve that, and music helps us sort of live into that. And again, this is all subject to sort of narratives and sacred goals, and this is how we work. This is religion. This is how everything comes together. Now, the maker of the video walks through his argument, agricultural. China was an agricultural country, and it had a poor economy. What do we mean by poor? Well, they were growing food for themselves, and they tried to have some things that they could export that other nations would want, and they would need that, and on and on and on and on. Again, way more hyperobjects. And then, they decided this path to industrialization, and the government is involved, and then they have to add infrastructure, and they have to attract foreign capital, and they have to use their own economy, and they have to have cheap labor. And so then they start growing these things. And then he says, well, what they should have done, like the United States and other more developed Western economies, is they should have been able to transition to a service economy. But they didn't, because because members of the Communist Party got so invested in getting wealthy with this industrialization plan that right now they've way overproduced. They've got housing for 3 billion people when in fact their population is collapsing, and they've got electric cars, for far more electric cars than their own economy can handle, so they're trying to sell them, and I mean the whole thing is just sort of falling apart. Now again, is this story true? Probably. I don't know. How am I to judge that? But I found it compelling, and I thought it was interesting, and I thought it was helpful, and I learned some stuff, I thought, and I continued to build that mapping in me about how the world works. But all of these things are very abstract, and you can talk to anybody who's a day trader or a Wall Street broker or an expert on economics, and they'll tell you this and they'll tell you that, but none of them can tell you with 100%. They'll find one guy who predicted something that's going to happen in the next couple of months with the stock market or the Federal Reserve or the American election or something, and they'll pick him out of the crowd 2 years from now and say, he predicted the great blank. Oh, he must know. And then he'll make all these other predictions, and, well, they won't come true. So much for that. So then we look at the world and we say, well, if all these Joe Schmoes are giving all these different predictions, somebody's going to get it right. You can look at how they put together The Good Place, that TV show. They talked about that. So you're stacking and manipulating all these hyperobjects to make an argument, to tell a story, just like I'm doing right now. I'm doing it myself. I'm using my emissary brain in order to sort of make an argument to you about how the emissary brain works, and you might find it compelling because you're in an emissary culture. This is just how we do, and it's a normal and good thing. We have no other way of doing it. But even this fine video's argument about China's economic development will be both disagreed with and in many respects found wanting. They always are. These hyperobjects are so complex that any argument or modeling about them will be limited in all sorts of ways. Nobody ever wins the stock market 100%. You can't get the timing right, and you can talk about reasons for that. Some Chinese are prospering from the failing economy, and others aren't. And maybe more aren't, and some are, and that's your measure. But again, it's always funny the way these things work in individual lives. Some people, in times of adversity, learn skills that help them to triumph in later periods, or their kids will triumph from it, or the world is astoundingly complex. And so there's this the world is, again, combinatorial explosiveness, the world is far more complex than we can imagine. And so we're always doing this relevance realization to sort of fit things together and put stories together and kind of have things work. You can't capture all of the complexity beneath in so simple an argument. We'll have a more complex argument. Okay, well, you can have a more complex argument. You can make a 300-hour video about the Chinese economy that very few people will watch and fewer people will grasp it. Or you can spend your entire life just focusing on China, or you can spend your entire life focusing on one particular family and either their happiness or misery, and you can never exhaust it. Again, back to combinatorial explosiveness. The difficulty that the emissary has is which facts, what hyperobject? Do they have the hyperobject right? Are they looking at the relevant piece? Is it Chinese development, or is it Chinese politics, or is it Chinese geography, or is it Chinese history? And again, any one of those things are hyperobjects for which there are far too many things to pay attention to. And so what we collectively do is draw our attention and say, oh, these are the important ones. And so we make an argument and we all agree, yeah, they failed to have a service economy, therefore, blah, 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 blah. 300 years from now, some historian is going to say, no, it's because of this, 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 and this, and they could have done this, this, and it would have been better. But, of course, what does that historian know? Because things get clearer as the facts recede, and what historians always do, of course, is look at what previous groups have thought were relevant and pay attention to those. So all of this is the work of Ian McGilchrist's Emissary. Super useful, super important, but one that always must be aware of its limitations. And this is exactly where emissarianism breaks down. Because when this is pushed too far, well, it gets pushed too far and then there's a fall. Well, there's always a fall. But it really can't grasp or attain the sacred no matter how it tries. And this, of course, is part of sort of the downfall of New Atheism, because I've talked about it before, that in some ways New Atheism was sort of like AIDS, because it got rid of the immune systems underneath all of these worldviews. And they said, oh, if we just stack up all the facts and data, Sam Harris, well, good and bad are clear and obvious. And the emissary can track what is good and bad and evil. And via the emissary, we can make this world a great place. But of course, we can't even agree on what is great. Great with respect to what? So New Atheism just really hasn't lasted long, because it just really didn't work that well, and it didn't work well for people. So many people are still working on all the stuff that's captured me for the last few weeks. Now, one of the huge great points that Chris Green made in my conversation with him is he makes the comment that part of, and he's really talking about emissarianism here. And I replayed that in I think it was the video with the obsolete shared religion of Trent Horn and Peter Boghossian. He makes the comment that what we've done is sort of put on top of our hierarchies people who can sort of take the world and reduce it down to a few simple things. Because it's an enormously powerful thing. Because, well, maybe it's interest rates in the economy, or maybe it's production, or maybe it's I'm no economist, so I'm not going to play with these things, or maybe it's this, or maybe it's that. And so Chris Green makes the observation that we've taken people who've done this and sort of put them in charge of everything. And, then you get sort of one size fits all things, like everybody has to take this vaccine, or everybody has to do this, or everybody has to do that. And what we've seen happening in the last number of years is that, well, we did a lot of the low-hanging fruit with things like polio and measles and that, but the more complex things, now we have all sorts of diseases like long COVID and chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia and Lyme's disease and gluten intolerance. And, it's just astounding that we don't know what to feed a human being. And all of us have been human beings all of our lives, and human beings have been eating for as long as we have recorded history. But if you go on YouTube or Instagram or Twitter or someplace, should we avoid meat or should we eat meat? Is sugar a great thing or is sugar a horrible thing? Or what is our ideal weight? Or on and on and on and on and on and on. Well, the emissaries thought they had this nailed down. And now all we just have is a war between emissaries. And Chris Green, I thought, had a tremendous insight that we overvalue simple summaries. And we both made the comment that people who live things have a richer sense of them because, again, the master, which is also sort of built up over the years, has a richer view of the world than the emissary that is paying attention to all the little details. Again, you need both, but they both have to play their part. Now, this is a lot of what Peugeot is trying to get at with his definition of religion as binding. That you can't understand, you can't have the United States without a narrative world, and you can't have China without a narrative world, and you can't have an economy without a narrative world, and you can't have the loss of an economy without a narrative world. And in fact, religions are the bindings of all of these things. And I sort of broaden the definition because Peugeot is articulating the master perspective and seeing the emissary that culturally we have deified. Well, how do Trent Horn and Peter Boghossian share a religion? One is Roman Catholic, arguing the supernatural. The other is atheist, arguing against the supernatural, but both very much. I mean, I was listening to that Trent Horn video. Somebody sent it to me, and he says, I'm committed to the truth more than anything. And I thought, that's hogwash. You are not. That's emissary propaganda. You were raised and molded and formed and shaped, and all of this has come together in who you are. The same with Peter Boghossian. No, we need to talk about truth claims. He keeps talking to Jonathan Peugeot about truth claims. So he keeps trying to do the emissary thing, and Peugeot keeps wanting to sort of pull the camera back and say, see it like the master. And understand that religions are sort of things that bind. And even your whole truth claim thing is sort of a religion that binds. And so, I don't want to make sweeping generalizations about both these guys. They're perfectly wonderful people. But what's astounding is that, again, depending on the frame, someone might say, no, they don't share a religion. Truth is they share tons of religions. That's why they can talk to each other. That's why they can do things together. That's why they can even have a meaningful argument about supernatural or not supernatural, because there's so many things that they share. But one of the things that they do share that they should probably give up is this emissarianism commitment or priority of it, because it just really doesn't work. And for many reasons, the arguments have been stuck here. And with what Peugeot has been doing and what we've been doing with Vervaeke and Peterson and company is trying to say, pull it back. You still might not win your argument with Peter Boghossian about why he should be Roman Catholic, and Peter Boghossian won't win his argument with Trent Horn about why he should abandon his faith in Jesus or Mary or, what have you in the Roman Catholic Church. You're probably not going to win your argument, but you'll probably have a better conversation. And the truth is, both of them are very able conversationalists, and both have wonderful conversations. I've only spoken with Peter. I haven't spoken with Trent Horn. And I often talk about the recession of modernity, and maybe I should talk about the recession of Emissarianism, but hardly anybody will understand what I'm talking about. McGilchrist, Peugeot, Peterson, and Vervaeke, and many, many others are watching this happen. And again, it's emissary processing and storytelling by which we're watching it, but hopefully both sides of this way of approaching the world are working together to say, this is what's happening. And its impact is the reevaluation of older, even definitions of religion, because the master brain is appreciated. That we see Christianity and we say, yeah, that's a huge thing. That's a hyper thing, as is Judaism, as is Buddhism, as is all of these things. And we're trying to get a grasp on them. And, I thought Chris Green's observation super helpful, but that doesn't stop me or Chris Green from doing exactly what he's complaining about. it just hopefully helps us take a step back from it and say, we hold our maps with a little more humility, and hopefully we can have the kinds of conversations where we can share our maps, and maybe Peter Boghossian has an atheist map and Trent Horn has a Catholic map, and maybe I'll in fact be able to learn from both of their maps as we go about our figuring out this world. Now, part of this has been sort of a revival in various perennialisms, and that's understandable, because whenever you sort of see the limitations of the emissary, well, lots of even sort of emissary-like master things sort of begin to crop up and come in. And I think part of this is sort of the rebirth of the belief in God that Justin Brierley is talking about too. People are more aware of big picture stuff, and what we're seeing right now is we're in a period of history where a lot of set categories that sort of held culture after the Second World War have been breaking down, and political factions are shifting, and religious factions are shifting, and we're probably about to enter a messy time. Hopefully it will be a less bloody time than the 20th century was. Now again, I've made 5-6 videos, and now finally I have a little bit more secure language and a video that's a little bit more emissary-like. Well, this is part of my annoying process. And if you think it makes annoying videos, well, making those annoying videos can somehow be both extremely meaningful and also extremely annoying to me too, because I'm just thinking out loud and I'm trying to get my mind around it, and I'm rambling and I'm going down rabbit trails and I'm going all over the place. And of course, a few hundred or a few thousand of you say, yeah, I like it when you do that. And tens of thousands of people say, boy, that guy's annoying. Why doesn't he get to the point? I just really want the emissary bullet points. And I say, yeah, me too. But I got some questions about those bullet points, because no sooner do I get on a bullet point than some of those bullet points lose their luster while others sort of endure. And this sort of gets at the kind of evolutionary way that we're starting to evaluate things. And you might say, yeah, that Darwinian perspective, that sure was evil. But in many ways, I think part of the reason we're seeing this rebirth is because we're appreciating the fact that truer things endure. We can call that the Lindy effect. Truer things endure, and less true things go away. And so we're gaining an appreciation for what a lot of ancients understood, even pre-Christian ancients. And we're having some skepticism about all the shiny new things that we've developed in the last few hundred years. So I think on the whole, it's a good process. So I make a video with a clickbaity title, and usually at the end of the video I sit there and say, now what did I just talk about? And then usually the emissary comes up with, here's what you just talked about. And of course, the master brain looks at it and says, yeah, but that leaves out a bunch of stuff. And yeah, that's kind of clickbaity. And yeah, but the emissary says, yeah, but it's kind of fun. And the master says, yeah, it is kind of fun. So go ahead. And so then I make a thumbnail, and then I have ideas about the thumbnail and say, what if I blend the two of them? Boy, that might be really obnoxious. So I'll do that, because a certain part of me likes being obnoxious. So clickbait, annoying, obnoxious titles that only gets this little corner initiate that the initiates could get. And others just kind of click on because he's attacking Trent Horn, I must defend him. He's attacking Peter Boghossian, I must defend him. Again, we're back to these religions and the participation, and so I can't allow my Catholic brother Trent Horn to be attacked by that Calvinist, and I can't allow my good friend Peter Boghossian to be attacked by that Calvinist, and then other people comment, you're a strange Calvinist. Other people say, you're not even a Calvinist. Why do you use that label? And on and on and on we go with all these hyper things. Most of my thoughts are, of course, half-baked. I think YouTube's a good place for half-baked thoughts. Maybe if I actually have thoughts that I'm a little bit more serious about, I'll write them down in a book. Books are a little bit more durable for harder thoughts that go through history. And maybe they'll be put on paper, and maybe the paper will be multiplied. And maybe after the great fall of Google someday and the destruction of YouTube, then maybe one or two thoughts that Vanderklay had, somebody somewhere will find them helpful. And that would be meaningful for me. So there's a little religion of YouTube making and bookmaking. But truth be told, many who clicked on the video didn't even watch it. They just watched the first 30 seconds and off they go. And YouTube tells me that too. But using the emissary to exercise the tyranny of emissarianism, I think, is helpful. And again, see Peugeot and how he's using religion, because naming is important. So I'm going all this, and I thought, what can I talk about? What does Trent Horn and Peter Boghossian have in common? Let's call it emissarianism. And again, part of the reason I make these videos is it forces me to talk. And as I talk, ideas come up and language comes up. And instead of having to sort of write it down and then figure out a file system and how to manage that, these are things I've been working on for 20 years with the thoughts that come up in my head that might appear in sermons or blog posts or things on CRC Voices or what have you on video. Well, it's out on the video. So if I ever have to look it up, I can think about who might be on the thumbnail and what might be in the title, and I can find the dumb thing. Or I can go to one of these lovely search engines now and just type in a word or two, and it'll read the transcript of my video, and boom, there it'll come up to the minute mark. Woohoo! Emissary is a powerful thing. Recently, Michael Satori had boomerality. That's continued to have me thinking. So there might be more videos about boomerality coming out. And this thing, what is a thing? It's deeply tied to a religion in many ways. Its spirit becomes visible. And we can see its coherence, and we can evaluate it, and we can manipulate it, and we do what we do. So again, none of us are giving up our emissary brain thinking. We need it. We need it to communicate. We need it to develop words, because in many ways, words are sort of finally the master and the emissary have a committee meeting, and they say, okay, let's try this word. And then we try it with each other. We put it out there. And does the word come back to me? Are more people using it? I don't know if Michael Satori thought up boomerality, but if he did, good for him. Someone somewhere applied woke to the thing, and that came up. And this is how we do words. They all come up. And then, as Bass said in the video today, the word community has been evolving. And that got me thinking. So maybe I'll make some shorts, because I haven't had time to make other things, but I haven't had time to make shorts either. So, and I'm not talking denim cutoff shorts, Kale Zeldin. So we have to keep the assumptions and the presuppositions and the limitations in mind. And that's basically the heart of the master and the emissary. Both sides need each other, but if they get too out of whack, well, if the master just sort of goes off into airy fairyland, never coming down, well, then people stop paying attention to it, because they have to work together. And, well, he's a Christian minister, he should talk about God. And sometimes people watch a video and say, you're a minister and you didn't say Jesus once. I just said it. I said Jesus in my video. So you can write that down. But, of course, I have videos way back there talk about God as the frame of frames and the master of masters and all of this. And Jordan Peterson's insight that he continued to work on, I think, is that functionally the system doesn't really work without God. Because God sort of, I think that, you know, and if you want to summarize why Jordan has had the impact he had, I think that's the reason. Because somehow there needs to be a master of masters that sort of has the big picture. But then there's like God number one and God number two. And God number one, again, God number one is arenic and God number two is agentic. So God number one is master. And God and number two is emissary. And now somebody's going to paint this on God the Father and God the Son, and on and on and on. And you can play those games, and those are fun games to play. And then once we say that functionally in the system there needs to be something like a God, then you get into like the ontological argument and the argument from morality, and some of the C.S. Lewis arguments. And you say, well, if it's functional in the system, isn't it likely that it actually in many ways meaningfully exists? But we can't emissary God. We can't even exhaust the hyperobjects that are around us. And in many ways, each of us is sort of a hyperobject. Now we have names, and We know a lot about each other, but we're also still mysteries to ourselves and to each other. And so you just can't reduce the world. You just wind up creating all these little idolatries. Or even the hyperobject. Even that category is really fuzzy. So basically, then we're sort of good enough. This is a good enough argument about why China is in a mess right now and hasn't sort of reached the peak that the United States has in some ways. And although the United States has all that debt, and it's just on and on and on and on and on. But most of our arguments are, again, just they're good enough for sort of good enough. But we worship and we do religion. And again, I think one of the real key takeaways that I've gotten out of all these years is the relationship between worship and attention. I thought a lot about that when I was in these museums in Europe and just looking at people who would never go to church at all, just looking at these religious artifacts and going into these religious buildings. And, worship helps contain Emissarianism, because worship is very big. Just listen to the songs in religious, the words in religious songs. They're not very emissary-like. And so worship helps limit emissarianism. We are only human beings. We bow before what is greater. We try to participate and invite the sacred into our worldviews, and we're always pursuing and chasing them. And we're mostly idolatrous, but we ask the Master of Masters for more. Here's a nice little, pastor has a nice little Christian message at the end of his wonky video with his made-up language. And that's the last slide. So I know some of you really love the short videos, so great. Some of you have probably said, well, Paul hasn't made a really long video for a while. Well, here's that one. Very emissary-like, made an argument, ran through it. There'll be plenty for y'all to chew on. So there it is. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment.